Hashtag the hook. Sarah Martinez never imagined that accepting a weekend hiking invitation would turn into a fight for survival that would make international headlines. What started as a simple climb with experienced mountaineers became a nightmare when her companions made a decision that shocked rescue teams worldwide. Left alone at 14,000 feet with no equipment, no food, and a storm approaching, Sarah faced impossible odds. But what happened next would prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most desperate situations, and that human determination can overcome even the cruelest betrayal. This is the true story of how a betrayal on a mountain peak led to one of the most extraordinary rescue missions ever attempted, where elite soldiers would risk everything to save a stranger who refused to give up. Sarah Martinez had always been drawn to challenges, but she never considered herself an extreme adventurer. At 28, she worked as a software engineer in Denver, spending most of her days behind a computer screen solving complex coding problems. Her idea of adventure usually involved weekend hikes on well-marked trails in the Colorado foothills, nothing too demanding or dangerous. She enjoyed the fresh air, the exercise, and the peaceful escape from city life. But she always returned home before dark with stories of beautiful views and wildlife sightings, not tales of survival and danger. The invitation came from Derek Hoffman, a colleague from her previous job at a tech startup. Derek had always struck her as confident, perhaps overconfident, with his expensive hiking gear and constant stories about conquering various peaks across Colorado. He was the type of person who seemed to collect adventures like trophies, always planning the next bigger, more challenging expedition. Sarah had worked with him for 2 years and knew he was capable and experienced, even if his ego sometimes got in the way of good judgment. "Sarah, you should come with us to Mount Elbert this weekend," Derek had said during a chance encounter at a coffee shop in downtown Denver. "It'll be perfect for someone at your level. Nothing too crazy, just a good workout and amazing views. Plus, we could use another person in the group to help with some of the gear." Mount Elbert, at 14,440 feet, was Colorado's highest peak and one of the famous 14ers that serious hikers in the state often attempted. Sarah had read about it online and knew it was considered one of the easier 14ers, with a well-established trail and no technical climbing required. Still, it would be her first time attempting anything above 12,000 feet, and the thought both excited and intimidated her. "Who else is going?" she had asked, stirring her coffee and trying to gauge whether this was something she could realistically handle. "My buddy Marcus Thompson and his girlfriend Lisa Chun," Derek replied. "Marcus is solid, been climbing for years. Lisa's pretty new to this stuff too, but she's in great shape. It's supposed to be beautiful weather this weekend, perfect conditions. We're planning to start early Saturday morning and make it a day trip." Sarah knew Marcus by reputation. He worked in finance downtown and was known in their shared circle of friends as someone who took fitness seriously. She had met him a few times at social gatherings and remembered him as quiet but competent, the type of person who spoke with authority about outdoor activities. Lisa she had met only once, but she seemed nice enough and appeared to be in excellent physical condition. The idea appealed to Sarah more than she initially expected. She had been feeling restless lately, stuck in routines that seemed to lead nowhere particularly exciting. Her job was stable but not inspiring. Her social life was pleasant but predictable, and she had been looking for something to shake up her normal patterns. A challenging hike with experienced people seemed like a reasonable way to push her boundaries without being reckless. "What kind of gear would I need?" she asked, already mentally going through her limited hiking equipment. "Nothing too specialized," Derek assured her. "Good hiking boots, layers for changing weather, plenty of water, some snacks. We've got the technical stuff covered. Marcus has a GPS unit, I've got first aid supplies, and Lisa's bringing extra emergency gear. You just need to focus on being ready for a long, steep hike." Sarah spent the next 3 days researching Mount Elbert and preparing for the expedition. She read trip reports online, studied maps of the area, and made sure her gear was appropriate for high-altitude hiking. She bought new hiking socks, tested her boots on longer walks, and even did some research about altitude sickness and how to recognize the symptoms. The mountain stood in the Sawatch Range, about a 2-hour drive southwest of Denver. The standard route was called the East Ridge Trail, which was supposed to be straightforward but demanding, gaining over 4,400 feet of elevation over about 4.5 miles. Most trip reports she read mentioned the importance of starting early to avoid afternoon thunderstorms, staying hydrated, and being prepared for rapidly changing weather conditions above Treeline. Sarah felt reasonably confident about her physical preparation. She ran regularly and hiked every weekend, usually covering 8 to 10 miles on mountain trails. Her longest single-day hike had been about 12 miles with 3,000 feet of elevation gain, which had been challenging but manageable. Mount Elbert would definitely be a step up, but she felt it was within her capabilities, especially with experienced partners. The night before the hike, Derek called to confirm the plan and go over final details. They would meet at a parking area near the trailhead at 6 in the morning, which meant Sarah would need to leave Denver by 4. The weather forecast looked good, with clear skies and temperatures ranging from the 30s at the start to potentially the 60s at lower elevations during the day. Above Treeline, it would be significantly colder and windier. Remember to bring extra layers, Derek reminded her. Weather can change fast up there, and it'll be cold at the summit even with good conditions. Also, bring more water than you think you need. Altitude makes you dehydrate faster. Sarah double-checked her pack that evening, organizing everything carefully. She had her new hiking boots, moisture-wicking base layers, an insulating middle layer, a waterproof shell jacket, warm gloves, a winter hat, sunglasses, sunscreen, and a headlamp. For food, she packed energy bars, trail mix, sandwiches, and electrolyte supplements. She carried 3 liters of water, which seemed like plenty for a day hike. Her backpack felt heavier than usual, but not unreasonably so. She estimated it weighed about 20 pounds, which was more than she typically carried, but not enough to slow her down significantly. She went to bed early, setting multiple alarms to ensure she would wake up in time for the early departure. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, though Sarah felt increasingly nervous as she got closer to the mountain. The darkness made it impossible to see the peak itself, but she could sense the massive presence of the high country around her. She arrived at the parking area exactly on time and found Derek, Marcus, and Lisa already there, organizing their gear by the light of headlamps. Marcus turned out to be exactly as she remembered him, quiet, methodical, and clearly experienced. His gear looked well used and carefully chosen, and he moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Lisa seemed energetic and excited, chatting enthusiastically about her previous hiking experiences and expressing eagerness to reach her first 14er summit. Perfect timing, Derek said as Sarah pulled up. Weather looks even better than predicted. We should have incredible views today. The parking area was already busy despite the early hour, with several other groups preparing for various hikes in the area. Sarah felt reassured by the activity and the presence of other experienced hikers. This was clearly a popular and well-traveled route, which meant help would be available if anything went wrong. As they began the approach to the actual trailhead, Sarah noticed that her 3 companions seemed to know each other much better than she had realized. They had clearly hiked together before and had developed efficient systems for sharing gear and coordinating their pace. She felt slightly like an outsider, but reminded herself that everyone had to start somewhere, and they had specifically invited her to join them. The trail began in dense forest, winding gradually upward through tall pine and aspen trees. Even with her headlamp, Sarah could see very little beyond the immediate path, but she could hear the sounds of other hikers ahead of and behind them. The pace felt comfortable, and conversation flowed easily among the 4 of them as they settled into the rhythm of the hike. The first major milestone came after about 2 hours of steady climbing when the group reached Treeline at approximately 11,800 feet. Sarah had never been this high before, and the transition from thick forest to open alpine terrain was both exhilarating and slightly intimidating. The trees became smaller and more scattered until they disappeared entirely, leaving only low shrubs, grasses, and rocky terrain stretching up toward the massive bulk of Mount Elbert's summit. The view that opened up before them was spectacular. Mountain ranges stretched in every direction, with peaks rising like waves across the landscape. The early morning light painted the ridges in shades of gold and pink, and the air had a crystalline clarity that made everything seem more vivid and immediate. Sarah stopped frequently to take photographs, amazed by the beauty surrounding them. "This is incredible," she said to Lisa, who was also taking a moment to appreciate the scenery. "I had no idea it would be this beautiful up here." Lisa smiled and nodded enthusiastically. "Wait until we get to the summit. The views get even better. This is why I love high-altitude hiking. There's nothing quite like being above Treeline on a clear day." Derek and Marcus were checking their GPS unit and consulting a topographic map, confirming their position and discussing the route ahead. From this point, the trail became much more obvious as it wound up the broad ridge toward the summit. The path was well marked with occasional cairns, and the terrain, while steep and rocky, presented no technical challenges. Sarah noticed that her breathing was becoming more labored as they gained altitude, but she didn't feel any symptoms of altitude sickness beyond the expected shortness of breath. She had read that some people were more sensitive to elevation than others, and she felt fortunate that her body seemed to be adapting well to the thinner air. The group took a longer break at Treeline to eat some food, drink water, and add or remove layers as needed. The temperature was perfect for hiking, cool enough to prevent overheating, but warm enough that they didn't need heavy insulation while moving. Sarah felt strong and optimistic about reaching the summit. As they continued climbing above Treeline, the character of the hike changed significantly. The terrain became more exposed and rocky, and the wind picked up noticeably. The trail, while still clear, required more attention to foot placement as loose rock became more common. Sarah found herself working harder to maintain the pace, but she was still feeling good overall. Derek continued to set the pace from the front, and Sarah began to notice that it was becoming more aggressive than it had been in the forested sections of the hike. She mentioned this to Lisa during one of their brief rest stops, but Lisa assured her that this was normal for high-altitude hiking where it was important to reach the summit and return below Treeline before afternoon weather developed. "Derek knows what he's doing," Lisa said. "He's climbed this peak before, and he understands the timing needed to stay safe up here. The pace might feel fast, but it's better to push a little now than to get caught in bad weather later." Marcus seemed comfortable with the pace and showed no signs of fatigue, which reassured Sarah that her own growing tiredness was probably normal for someone attempting her first 14er. She focused on maintaining steady breathing and staying hydrated, stopping frequently to drink water and eat small amounts of food. The landscape around them became increasingly dramatic as they climbed higher. The slopes were covered with loose rock and scree, and the drop-offs on either side of the ridge became more pronounced. Sarah found herself occasionally feeling dizzy when she looked down into the valleys below, amazed by how high they had climbed and how exposed their position had become. At around 13,000 feet, Sarah began to feel the effects of altitude more seriously. Her breathing became noticeably more difficult, and she found herself needing to rest more frequently. The pace that had felt challenging but manageable at lower elevations now seemed quite demanding, and she began to worry about whether she would have enough energy to reach the summit and return safely. "How much further to the top?" she asked Derek during one of their brief stops. Derek consulted his GPS and pointed toward a rocky outcrop high above them. "About another hour and a half, maybe 2 hours depending on how we feel. The last section gets pretty steep, but once we're up there, we'll have amazing views and can take a long break before heading down." Sarah looked up at the terrain ahead and felt a mixture of determination and apprehension. The summit looked much further away than Derek's time estimate suggested, and the route appeared to involve some challenging scrambling over loose rock. She reminded herself that thousands of people climbed this mountain every year without incident, and that her companions were experienced and trustworthy. The group continued climbing, but Sarah noticed that the dynamic between her 3 companions was beginning to change in subtle ways. Derek seemed increasingly focused on reaching the summit quickly, checking his watch frequently, and urging everyone to minimize rest stops. Marcus appeared to be growing impatient with the pace, occasionally moving ahead of the group, and then waiting with visible frustration for the others to catch up. Lisa remained encouraging and supportive, but Sarah could sense that she was also feeling pressure to move faster than was comfortable for her. The easy camaraderie that had characterized the early part of the hike was being replaced by a more tense and goal-oriented atmosphere that made Sarah feel increasingly like a burden on the group. Maybe I should turn around, Sarah suggested during one rest stop when she was breathing particularly hard. I don't want to slow everyone down, and I'm starting to feel pretty tired. Nonsense, Derek replied immediately. We're more than halfway there, and you're doing fine. It would be crazy to turn around now when the summit is so close. You'll regret it forever if you give up when you could have made it. Marcus nodded in agreement. Derek's right. The hardest part is behind us now. Once we get above 13,500 feet, the angle eases off, and the last section is actually pretty easy. You've come too far to quit now. Lisa put a supportive hand on Sarah's shoulder. I felt exactly the same way on my first 14er. The altitude makes everything feel harder than it really is. Just focus on one step at a time, and before you know it, we'll be at the top taking pictures. Encouraged by their words, and not wanting to disappoint the group, Sarah agreed to continue. She told herself that discomfort was normal and temporary, and that the sense of accomplishment from reaching the summit would make all the current difficulty worthwhile. She had never been a quitter, and she wasn't about to start now. The climb continued, but Sarah's condition began to deteriorate more rapidly than she expected. Her headache, which had been mild and manageable, became more severe and persistent. Her nausea, which she had attributed to exertion and nerves, increased to the point where eating became difficult. Most concerning, she began to feel confused and disoriented, having trouble remembering recent conversations and losing track of how long they had been climbing. Despite these warning signs, which Sarah didn't fully recognize as symptoms of altitude sickness, the group pressed on toward the summit. The terrain became increasingly challenging, with loose rock and steep sections that required careful attention to foot and hand placement. Sarah found herself falling behind more frequently, and her companions had to wait for her at regular intervals. Derek's impatience became more obvious as the day progressed. He made comments about the need to maintain their schedule and expressed concern about getting caught on the mountain late in the day. Marcus began to take over some of the pace-setting responsibilities, moving ahead to scout the route and then returning to guide the group through difficult sections. As they climbed above 13,500 feet, Sarah's symptoms became severe enough that she could no longer hide her distress. She was struggling to breathe even during rest stops. Her headache had become debilitating, and she was feeling increasingly nauseous and dizzy. The combination of symptoms was making it difficult for her to think clearly or make good decisions about her own safety. I think I need to turn around, she announced during a rest stop about 400 feet below the summit. I'm not feeling good at all, and I don't think I should go any higher. The response from her companions was not what she expected. Instead of expressing concern for her welfare or offering to accompany her back down the mountain, they seemed primarily frustrated by the potential impact on their own summit plans. We're so close to the top, Derek said with obvious annoyance. It would be ridiculous to turn around now when we can literally see the summit. You just need to push through the discomfort for another hour. Marcus was more direct in his frustration. Look, Sarah, we've been hiking for 6 hours to get this far. We're not going to give up on the summit because you're feeling a little tired. Altitude affects everyone differently, but the only way to get better is to keep moving. Even Lisa, who had been consistently supportive throughout the final push to Mount Elbert's summit, took another grueling hour and 15 minutes. Sarah's condition continued to deteriorate with each step upward, but she forced herself to continue, driven by a combination of determination, peer pressure, and the increasingly impaired judgment that comes with severe altitude sickness. Her headache had become so intense that it felt like her skull was being compressed in a vice, and her nausea was now accompanied by occasional dry heaving that left her weak and shaky. Derek and Marcus had begun to show their impatience more openly, making comments about the time they were losing and expressing concern about getting off the mountain before dark. Lisa tried to remain supportive, but Sarah could sense that she too was becoming frustrated with the slow pace and frequent rest stops that Sarah's deteriorating condition required. The summit of Mount Elbert was marked by a large cairn and offered spectacular 360-degree views of the Colorado Rockies. On a clear day like this one, climbers could see for more than 100 miles in every direction, taking in dozens of other 14ers, and the vast expanse of high-altitude wilderness that made this region famous among mountain enthusiasts. When they finally reached the top, Sarah felt a brief surge of accomplishment and relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by how terrible she felt physically. Instead of the euphoria and sense of achievement that she had expected, she experienced mainly exhaustion, nausea, and a persistent feeling that something was seriously wrong with her body. The group spent about 20 minutes at the summit taking photographs and eating lunch. Sarah tried to eat something, but found that food made her nausea worse, so she focused on trying to drink water and rest as much as possible. She hoped that reaching the highest point of the day would mark the beginning of her recovery, as she had read that descending to lower altitude often provided rapid relief from altitude-related symptoms. Derek and Marcus spent most of the summit break discussing their route options for descent and checking weather conditions in the surrounding area. The weather remained clear and stable, with no signs of the afternoon thunderstorms that were common in the Colorado high country during summer months. From a weather perspective, they had chosen a perfect day for the climb. "Okay, time to head down," Derek announced after checking his watch. "We need to get below Treeline before too late in the day, and Sarah's obviously struggling with the altitude. The sooner we get her down to lower elevation, the better she's going to feel." The group began the descent, but Sarah immediately discovered that going downhill was not providing the relief she had hoped for. Her symptoms remained severe, and the steep, rocky terrain actually made the descent more challenging than the ascent had been. Loose rock and scree made each step treacherous, and her impaired coordination from altitude sickness increased her risk of falling. Sarah found herself moving very slowly and carefully, testing each foot placement and frequently using her hands for balance on the steeper sections. Her companions, who had been eager to reach the summit quickly, were now equally eager to descend rapidly, and her pace became an increasing source of tension within the group. About an hour into the descent, when they had dropped approximately 500 feet from the summit but were still well above Treeline at nearly 14,000 feet, the situation reached a crisis point. Sarah was moving so slowly that Derek estimated it would take them 6 or 7 hours to reach the trailhead at their current pace, which would put them hiking in darkness for the final portion of the descent. "This isn't working," Derek said during a rest stop where Sarah was dry heaving and could barely lift her head. "We're going to be out here all night at this pace, and that's going to be dangerous for everyone." Marcus nodded in agreement. "We need to move a lot faster than this. Maybe Sarah should try to push through the symptoms and pick up the pace. Sometimes that's the only way to deal with altitude sickness." Sarah tried to explain that she was moving as fast as she could and that she felt like she was going to collapse if she tried to go any faster. Her speech was becoming slurred and confused, and she was having difficulty organizing her thoughts well enough to communicate effectively with her companions. "I think I'm really sick," she managed to say between waves of nausea. "This doesn't feel like normal altitude problems. Something is wrong with me." Lisa knelt down next to Sarah and looked into her eyes, checking her pupil response and trying to assess her condition more carefully. What she saw concerned her, but not enough to override the group's desire to get off the mountain quickly. "She's definitely got altitude sickness," Lisa confirmed. "But the only cure is to get to lower elevation as fast as possible. Maybe we should split up. Some of us could go ahead and get help while others stay with Sarah." Derek and Marcus exchanged a look that Sarah, in her impaired state, didn't fully notice or understand. They had been hiking together for several years and had developed an almost telepathic communication about mountain decisions. What passed between them in that moment was a cold calculation about their options and priorities. "Actually," Derek said slowly, "I think we have a better idea. Sarah, you're clearly too sick to continue at any reasonable pace. The best thing for everyone would be if you just stay here and rest while the three of us go get help. We can move fast without having to worry about your pace, and we'll be back with rescue personnel in just a few hours." Sarah's altered mental state from altitude sickness made it difficult for her to process this suggestion properly. But even through her confusion, She sensed that something was wrong with this plan. "Stay here alone?" she asked, trying to clear her head enough to think through the implications. At this altitude, without any gear, Marcus had already started going through the group's equipment, separating items that they would need for a rapid descent from items that would be left behind. His movements were efficient and businesslike, as if he had thought through this scenario before. "We'll leave you some water and food," Marcus said without looking directly at her. "And you'll be fine for a few hours. The weather is perfect, and you'll actually feel better if you can rest without having to push yourself to keep moving." Lisa looked uncertain about this plan, but didn't voice any strong objections. "Are you sure this is the best option? Shouldn't one of us stay with her?" Derek was already shouldering his pack and preparing to leave. "If one of us stays, it defeats the purpose. We need to move fast to get help quickly. Sarah will be safer resting here than trying to stumble down the mountain in her condition. This way, everyone gets what they need." The speed with which Derek and Marcus implemented this decision left Sarah little opportunity to object or negotiate. Before she fully understood what was happening, they had separated most of the group's essential gear, keeping the navigation equipment, first aid supplies, emergency shelter, and most of the food and water for themselves. They left her with a water bottle that was less than half full, 2 energy bars, and a thin emergency blanket that would provide minimal protection against cold. No navigation equipment, no first aid supplies, no emergency communication device, and no warm clothing beyond what she was already wearing. "We'll be back with help before dark," Derek promised as the three of them prepared to leave. "Just stay put, try to stay warm, and don't attempt to go anywhere on your own. The worst thing you could do would be to get lost trying to find your way down." Sarah watched in growing horror as her 3 companions began walking away from her down the mountainside. Even in her impaired state, she understood that this was abandonment, not rescue. They were leaving her alone at nearly 14,000 feet with insufficient supplies, no way to navigate, and no means of communication with the outside world. "Wait," she called after them, her voice weak and desperate. "Don't leave me here. Please don't leave me here alone." But Derek, Marcus, and Lisa continued walking without looking back. Within 15 minutes, they had disappeared from view behind a rocky outcrop, leaving Sarah completely alone on the exposed mountainside with afternoon clouds beginning to build on the horizon and her condition continuing to deteriorate. The magnitude of her situation began to penetrate Sarah's altitude. The first few hours after Sarah's companions disappeared were the darkest of her life. The combination of severe altitude sickness, growing panic about her situation, and the gradual realization that she had been deliberately abandoned created a psychological crisis that threatened to be even more dangerous than her physical predicament. Sarah spent the initial period after being left alone simply sitting on a flat rock, trying to process what had happened and fighting waves of nausea and disorientation that made clear thinking nearly impossible. The thin air at nearly 14,000 feet meant that every breath required conscious effort, and her headache had become so severe that even small movements of her head caused sharp spikes of pain. As afternoon moved toward evening, the weather began to change in ways that made her situation dramatically more dangerous. The clear skies that had provided perfect climbing conditions earlier in the day gave way to building clouds, and the temperature started dropping noticeably as the sun moved lower in the sky. Without the warmth of physical exertion to maintain her body temperature, Sarah began to feel cold despite the emergency blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The emergency blanket that Derek and Marcus had left with her was little more than a thin sheet of reflective material designed for temporary shelter in mild conditions. It provided minimal insulation and no protection from wind, which was beginning to pick up as the weather deteriorated. Sarah quickly realized that this piece of equipment was inadequate for surviving a night at high altitude. Her water situation was equally desperate. The half-empty bottle that remained after her companions took the majority of the group's water would last perhaps 2 or 3 hours under normal conditions. At high altitude, where dehydration occurred much more rapidly, she knew she would be in serious trouble well before morning if she couldn't find additional water sources. The 2 energy bars represented her entire food supply, enough calories for perhaps 6 to 8 hours under the best circumstances. More critically, Both items required water to digest properly, meaning that eating them would accelerate her dehydration problem. Sarah faced the impossible choice between maintaining her energy levels and conserving her precious water supply. As the sun moved lower in the sky, Sarah forced herself to think more strategically about survival priorities. Her altitude sickness symptoms, while debilitating, seemed to have stabilized rather than continuing to worsen. This suggested that her body was beginning to adapt to the elevation, or at least that she was not developing the most life-threatening forms of altitude illness. The most immediate threats to her survival were cold and dehydration. Hypothermia could kill her within hours once the sun set, and temperatures dropped below freezing, which was virtually guaranteed at her elevation even during summer months. Dehydration would weaken her ability to maintain body temperature and make rational decisions, creating a downward spiral that could be fatal even if she survived the night. Sarah began to explore her immediate surroundings more systematically, looking for any resources that might improve her chances of survival. The rocky terrain around her was typical of high-altitude environments, with scattered boulders, patches of alpine vegetation, and occasional small depressions that might provide some shelter from wind. About 50 yards from where she had been abandoned, Sarah discovered a small seasonal stream fed by snowmelt from higher elevations. The water was ice-cold and crystal clear, providing a solution to her most immediate problem. She refilled her water bottle and drank deeply, knowing that staying hydrated was essential for maintaining her body's ability to function in the extreme environment. The discovery of water gave Sarah her first glimmer of hope since being abandoned. If she could solve the shelter and warmth problems, she might be able to survive until rescue arrived. The question was whether anyone would actually come looking for her, and how long she could hold out if they didn't. Sarah began to construct an improvised shelter using the largest rocks in the area. Her engineering background helped her think systematically about the physics of heat retention and wind protection. By positioning herself in a depression between large boulders and using smaller rocks to create additional wind barriers, she was able to create a space that was noticeably warmer than the exposed mountainside. The emergency blanket, while inadequate on its own, became much more effective when used in combination with the rock shelter. By reflecting her body heat back toward her and blocking some of the wind, it transformed from nearly useless to marginally sufficient for short-term survival. Sarah also gathered dried grass and small pieces of vegetation to use as additional insulation between her body and the cold rock. As the sun set and temperatures plummeted, Sarah's situation became a minute-by-minute battle for survival. The cold was unlike anything she had ever experienced, penetrating through her clothing and shelter to reach her core body temperature. Her extremities became numb within the first hour of darkness, and she had to work constantly to maintain circulation in her hands and feet. Sarah discovered that movement was essential for staying warm, but movement also used precious energy and water that she could not afford to waste. She developed a routine of isometric exercises that generated heat without requiring her to leave her shelter or consume too much of her limited reserves. The psychological challenges of survival were as difficult as the physical ones. Alone in complete darkness on the exposed mountainside, Sarah faced hours of terror as she listened to the sounds of wind and weather around her. Every noise could indicate changing conditions that might threaten her survival, and the isolation created a mental environment where fear and panic could easily overwhelm rational thinking. Sarah forced herself to focus on practical tasks and short-term goals rather than dwelling on the magnitude of her situation. She organized her supplies, monitored her water consumption, and maintained her exercise routine, creating structure and purpose that helped prevent psychological collapse. Throughout the long night, Sarah's anger at her companions served as an unexpected source of strength. The betrayal she had experienced was so complete and cruel that it generated a fierce determination to survive, if only to ensure that they would be held accountable for what they had done. She channeled her rage into the will to live, using it as fuel for the physical and mental effort required to make it through each hour. As the night progressed, Sarah began to develop a longer-term survival strategy. If rescue didn't arrive quickly, she would need to find a way to descend the mountain on her own. This would require recovering from her altitude sickness, finding additional food and water sources, and navigating her way back to civilization without maps or GPS equipment. The challenges of self-rescue from her position were enormous. She was still suffering from altitude-related symptoms that impaired her judgment and coordination. She had no navigation equipment and only a vague memory of the route they had taken to reach the summit. The terrain between her location and the trailhead included numerous opportunities to become lost or injured, either of which could be fatal in her weakened condition. Despite these obstacles, Sarah began to plan her descent route based on her memories of the ascent and her general knowledge of mountain geography. She knew that following water sources downhill would eventually lead to lower elevations and potentially to human activity. She also remembered that the standard climbing route was marked with cairns that might be visible even to someone without extensive navigation experience. Dawn brought both relief and new challenges. The end of the Sarah's attempt at self-rescue began at first light on what would prove to be one of the most extraordinary days in Colorado's search and rescue history. Armed with nothing more than her engineering training, determination to survive, and burning anger at the people who had abandoned her, she began picking her way down the treacherous rocky slopes of Mount Elbert's upper elevations. Her strategy was simple but dangerous. Follow water sources downhill while staying as close as possible to what she remembered of the standard climbing route. The stream where she had found water the night before became her lifeline, providing not only drinking water but also a general direction that she hoped would lead towards civilization. The descent was immediately more difficult than Sarah had anticipated. Her legs were weak from altitude sickness and the stress of surviving the night, and the loose rock and scree that covered the mountainside made every step treacherous. She fell repeatedly during the first hour, scraping her hands and knees on sharp rocks and using precious energy to regain her balance and continue moving. Progress was agonizingly slow. Terrain that had taken her group less than an hour to ascend the previous day now required 3 or 4 hours to descend safely. Sarah had to test each foothold carefully and frequently detour around obstacles that would have been simple to navigate under normal circumstances. Her altered judgment from altitude and exhaustion made it difficult to assess risks accurately. Meanwhile, 12 miles away at the Mount Elbert trailhead, a situation was developing that would soon bring unexpected help to Sarah's desperate circumstances. Derek, Marcus, and Lisa had reached their vehicle the previous evening and driven back to Denver, apparently unconcerned about the woman they had left stranded on the mountainside. However, their plan to simply disappear and avoid responsibility for what they had done was complicated by a detail they had overlooked. Sarah's emergency contact information, which she had provided to Derek before the hike, included her brother Michael Martinez, a captain in the Army Rangers who was stationed at nearby Fort Carson. When Sarah failed to return home by Sunday evening as planned, Michael became increasingly concerned. His military training had taught him to take emergency protocols seriously, and he knew that Sarah was responsible and reliable about communicating her whereabouts. When repeated calls to her cell phone went straight to voicemail, and she failed to respond to text messages, he began trying to contact Derek and the other members of the hiking group. Derek initially tried to cover up what had happened by telling Michael that Sarah had decided to stay an extra day in the mountains and that she was fine. This explanation might have worked with someone less experienced in military operations, but Michael's training immediately identified inconsistencies in Derek's story. "Where exactly is my sister staying?" Michael asked during a phone conversation late Sunday night. "Which campground or hotel?" Derek's inability to provide specific details, combined with his obvious nervousness and evasive answers, convinced Michael that something was seriously wrong. When Derek finally admitted under pressure that he hadn't actually seen Sarah since leaving the trailhead, Michael realized that his sister was in immediate danger. Michael contacted the Lake County Sheriff's Office, which coordinated search and rescue operations for the Mount Elbert area, but was told that formal search operations could not begin until Sarah had been missing for at least 24 hours. The delay was standard protocol, but it was unacceptable to someone who understood how quickly conditions could become fatal in high-altitude environments. Rather than wait for official rescue operations to begin, Michael contacted his unit at Fort Carson and assembled a team of Army Rangers who volunteered to conduct an immediate search mission using their own time and equipment. These were elite soldiers trained in high-altitude operations and mountain rescue, with access to specialized gear and techniques that far exceeded the capabilities of civilian rescue teams. The Rangers' plan was bold and unconventional. Instead of following the standard hiking trail, which would have taken 8 to 10 hours of climbing, they would use helicopter insertion to reach the high-altitude areas where Sarah was most likely to be located. This approach would allow them to cover vast amounts of terrain quickly and reach areas that would be impossible for ground teams to access in time to save someone who had already been exposed to extreme conditions for more than 24 hours. By Monday morning, while Sarah was struggling through her desperate self-rescue attempt, Michael had assembled a team of 8 Army Rangers and secured the use of a military helicopter for what was technically classified as a training exercise in high-altitude search and rescue operations. The helicopter reached Mount Elbert's summit region at approximately 10:30 a.m., just as Sarah was making her way slowly down through the most dangerous sections of loose rock and steep terrain above Treeling. The Rangers began their search using systematic grid patterns and advanced optical equipment that allowed them to cover large areas quickly and effectively. Staff Sergeant James Wilson, the team's lead climber and rescue specialist, spotted Sarah through binoculars at approximately 11:45 a.m. She was about 1,200 feet below the summit, moving very slowly across a steep section of scree and clearly in serious distress. The location where she was spotted was nearly a mile from the standard climbing trail, indicating that she had become disoriented during her descent. "I've got eyes on a solo hiker in obvious trouble," Wilson reported to Michael over the radio. Female, blonde hair, red jacket, moving very slowly across the east face. Elevation approximately 13,200 feet. She appears to be attempting to self-rescue but is in immediate danger. The Rangers faced a critical decision about how to reach Sarah quickly and safely. The helicopter could not land at her elevation due to the thin air and treacherous terrain, and a traditional rescue approach would take several hours to organize and execute. Sarah's condition appeared to be deteriorating rapidly, and weather conditions were beginning to change in ways that could make helicopter operations impossible. Michael made the decision that would later make this rescue famous in military circles. He and Wilson would rappel from the helicopter directly to Sarah's location, an extremely dangerous maneuver at high altitude that violated numerous safety protocols, but offered the only realistic chance of reaching her in time. The helicopter hovered at approximately 14,000 feet, while Michael and Wilson prepared their equipment for the rappel. The thin air made the helicopter's performance marginal, and the pilot had to fight constantly to maintain stable positioning in the unpredictable wind conditions around the mountain's upper elevations. At 12:15 p.m., Michael and Wilson rappelled 200 feet down to Sarah's position, landing on a narrow ledge just above where she had collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. The physical demands of the rappel at extreme altitude left both Rangers breathing hard, but they immediately began assessing Sarah's condition and preparing her for evacuation. Sarah's first glimpse of the 2 camouflaged figures descending from the sky seemed like a hallucination brought on by altitude and stress. When she realized that they were real and that help had actually arrived, she experienced an emotional breakdown that combined relief, gratitude, and rage at what her companions had done to her. "They left me here to die," were her first coherent words to Michael after he reached her side. "They took all the gear and just walked away. They said they would come back with help, but they never intended to return." Michael's assessment of his sister's condition was alarming. She was severely dehydrated, suffering from moderate hypothermia, and showing signs of exhaustion that indicated she was close to complete physical collapse. Her improvised shelter and survival techniques had kept her alive, but she would not have survived another night at that elevation. The extraction process required careful coordination between the Rangers on the ground and the helicopter crew above. Sarah was secured in a specialized rescue harness and lifted by winch to the helicopter, followed by Michael and Wilson. The entire rescue operation from initial contact to successful evacuation took less than 45 minutes, a a remarkable achievement under such challenging conditions. Sarah was transported directly to Vale Valley Medical Center, where she was treated for severe dehydration, mild hypothermia, and altitude-related symptoms. Her physical recovery was rapid once she received proper medical care, but the psychological impact of her experience would take much longer to heal. The investigation into how Sarah came to be stranded on Mount Elbert began within hours of her rescue. Michael's detailed debriefing of his sister, combined with interviews of Derek, Marcus, and Lisa, quickly revealed the truth about what had happened on the mountain. Derek initially attempted to maintain the fiction that they had become separated accidentally and that they had immediately sought help when they realized Sarah was missing. However, inconsistencies in the stories provided by the three companions, combined with Sarah's detailed account of being deliberately abandoned, made it clear that this had been no accident. The legal consequences for Derek, Marcus, and Lisa were severe and unprecedented. Colorado law enforcement had rarely dealt with a case involving deliberate abandonment in wilderness conditions, but the evidence was overwhelming that they had made a conscious decision to leave Sarah in life-threatening circumstances. All three were charged with criminal endangerment, reckless endangerment, and abandonment of a person in distress. Derek and Marcus, who had been the primary decision-makers in abandoning Sarah, also faced charges of attempted negligent homicide. The case attracted national media attention as an example of how the pursuit of personal goals could lead to complete moral failure. The legal proceedings revealed additional disturbing details about the defendants' motivations and decision-making process. Cell phone records showed that they had discussed abandoning Sarah via text message before even reaching the summit, suggesting that this had been a premeditated decision rather than a spontaneous reaction to difficult circumstances. During the trial, expert witnesses testified about the extreme dangers that Sarah had faced and the near certainty that she would have died if not for her brother's immediate action and the Rangers' extraordinary rescue mission. The court learned that temperatures at her elevation had dropped to 15 degrees below zero on the night she was abandoned, and that her improvised survival techniques had been the only factors preventing fatal hypothermia. Derek was sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay substantial restitution to cover Sarah's medical expenses and the costs of the rescue operation. Marcus received a 3-year sentence, while Lisa, who had shown some reluctance to abandon Sarah, received 2 years of probation and community service. The case became a landmark in wilderness law enforcement and led to significant changes in how Colorado authorities handle cases involving abandonment in backcountry environments. New legislation was passed requiring criminal background checks for commercial guide services and establishing clear legal standards for the duty of care that hiking companions owe to each other in wilderness settings. For Sarah, the physical and legal resolution of her ordeal marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. The experience had revealed reserves of strength and determination that she had never known she possessed, but it had also left her with a profound understanding of how quickly trust could be betrayed and how close civilization always remained to primitive survival situations. Sarah eventually returned to mountain hiking, but with a much deeper respect for the risks involved and a careful attention to the character and reliability of her companions. Her story became an inspiration to other outdoor enthusiasts and a reminder that survival often depends as much on mental strength and determination as on technical skills and equipment. Michael's unit received commendations for their innovative rescue techniques, and the successful mission became a case study in military training programs for high-altitude rescue operations. The Rangers' willingness to take extraordinary risks to save a civilian exemplified the values of service and sacrifice that defined their profession. The Mount Elbert rescue demonstrated that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge in moments of greatest need, and that human courage and determination can overcome even the most desperate circumstances. Sarah's survival was a testament to the power of refusing to give up, even when faced with betrayal, abandonment, and seemingly impossible odds in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Terrifying night meant that Sarah had survived the most immediate threat to her life, but it also marked the beginning of a new day in which she would have to take action to improve her situation. Her companions had now been gone for nearly 18 hours, making it clear that their promise to return with help had been a lie. Sarah's physical condition had actually improved somewhat during the night. Her altitude sickness symptoms were noticeably less severe than they had been the previous day, and her thinking was clearer and more organized. The rest, combined with her body's continued acclimatization to the elevation, had restored some of her functional capacity. She used the early morning hours to drink more water from the stream, eat one of her energy bars, and prepare for what she knew would be a desperate attempt to save her own life. The beautiful sunrise that illuminated the mountain peaks around her provided a stark contrast to the life-or-death situation in which she found herself. Sarah understood that she could not survive another night at this elevation without better shelter and supplies. Her water and food would not last through another day, and her improvised shelter had been barely adequate for one night under relatively good weather conditions. If she was going to survive, she had to begin moving toward lower altitude immediately. The decision to attempt self-rescue was terrifying but unavoidable. Sarah gathered her minimal supplies, took a final drink from the stream, and began the most important journey of her life, a desperate descent down Mount Elbert that would test every limit of her endurance and determination while racing against time, weather, and the limits of human survival at extreme altitude. Impaired consciousness. She was stranded at an elevation where the human body could not survive indefinitely, with insufficient water to last more than a few hours, no protection against the extreme temperature swings that occurred at high altitude, and no way to call for help or signal her location to potential rescuers. The three people she had trusted with her safety had made a calculated decision to prioritize their own convenience over her survival. They had abandoned her in conditions that they knew were potentially fatal, with reassurances that they almost certainly knew were false. The rescue they had promised was nothing more than a cover story to justify their decision to leave her behind. As the afternoon wore on and storm clouds began to gather around the higher peaks, Sarah realized that her former companions were not coming back. She was entirely on her own in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, facing a night that would test every limit of human survival and force her to find reserves of strength and determination that she never knew she possessed. The betrayal was complete, but Sarah's fight for survival was just beginning. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most extraordinary human capabilities emerge only when facing the most desperate circumstances, and that the will to live can overcome even the cruelest abandonment. Ide seemed reluctant to abandon the summit attempt. Maybe you could just rest here while we go to the top? We'll only be gone for about an hour, and then we can all descend together. That way, nobody has to miss out on the summit. Sarah felt confused and uncertain. Her instincts told her that she was in serious trouble and needed to descend immediately, but her companions, who were supposed to be experienced and knowledgeable, were telling her that her symptoms were normal and that continuing upward was the right decision. The altitude was making it difficult for her to think clearly and trust her own judgment. Against her better instincts, and influenced by the pressure from her companions and her own desire not to be seen as weak or unprepared, Sarah agreed to continue toward the summit. It was a decision that would have consequences none of them could have anticipated, and that would transform a challenging but routine hiking trip into a survival situation that would test every limit of human endurance and reveal the true character of everyone involved. Derek took the lead, setting a steady but not aggressive pace. Marcus followed. Then, Lisa, with Sarah bringing up the rear. This arrangement felt natural and allowed Sarah to observe the techniques and pacing of the more experienced hikers ahead of her. She was pleased to discover that she felt strong and comfortable even as the trail began to steepen. As the sun began to rise, the forest around them became visible, revealing beautiful tall trees and occasional glimpses of higher peaks through the canopy. Sarah felt increasingly excited about the day ahead and grateful that she had accepted Derek's invitation. This was exactly the kind of experience she had been looking for, challenging enough to be meaningful, but not so difficult as to be dangerous or miserable. The first few miles passed quickly, with the group maintaining good energy and spirits. Sarah found herself falling into the meditative rhythm that she loved about hiking, where physical exertion combined with beautiful surroundings to create a sense of peace and accomplishment. She began to feel confident that she had made the right decision and that this would be a successful and enjoyable adventure. None of them could have predicted how dramatically the day would change, or how a simple hiking trip would transform into something that would test every limit of human endurance and challenge everything they thought they knew about trust, survival, and the bonds between people in extreme situations.